Tensions on the Korean peninsula continue to make international headlines as Seoul and Washington prepare to hold their Freedom Shield exercise starting next Monday amid Pyongyang's adamant ambitions for nuclear weapons. So what has been the response to North Korea's most recent bellicose rhetoric? What are the implications of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo's claim against South Korea's nuclear weapons possession? And what has been the regional response to President Yoon Suk-yeol's Independence Movement Day speech? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. We start the work week with a check on stories here in this part of the world that made international headlines as well. For more on that, I have Anthony Kuhn here in the studio. Anthony, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you so much.
I also have Malene Jensen with us. Malene, welcome back.
Thank you.
Anthony, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with a few words on the regional security issue here in this part of the world. News of South Korea-U.S.'s Freedom Shield exercise, which are slated for next week, made headlines last Friday. Do start by telling us a bit about this planned military drill and its purpose as well as scale.
It's looking like a very big year for military exercises. Freedom Shield itself is 11 days of joint exercises, which include computer simulations and field exercises, an amphibious landing drill. Also going on recently, we have a special forces operations troops doing exercises called Teak Knife, which reportedly have been simulating special forces infiltrating and attacking North Korean command and leadership facilities. For quite some time, we've been seeing the U.S. Make good on its promise to rotate so-called strategic assets, including aircraft carriers, submarines, and long-range bombers through the region. That's been happening, and the rhetoric has been amping up on both sides. Over the weekend, we saw warnings from North Korea saying that the U.S. is causing the collapse of the international arms control system, and that the U.S., South Korea, and Japan are crossing a red line. Also, we've heard Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, say this year that North Korea could turn the Pacific Ocean into a firing range. Pyongyang, of course, sees all these military drills by the Allies as preparations for a war of aggression. So the general trend seems to be of a sort of a tit-for-tat response on both sides. That leads to concerns about escalation. South Korea's defense ministry has said that it's possible that North Korea could use the Allies' drills as a pretense or an excuse to conduct a seventh nuclear test. That would be quite serious. It's not clear, though, that the U.S. and South Korea have any new responses to those. It would appear to be more of the same, more military drills and more economic sanctions in response.
Right. And Malene, like Anthony said, North Korea has been blaming the U.S. and South Korea, their joint military drills, that is, for raising tensions here on this part of the world. Another blame game was played out, I believe, at the UN conference on disarmament last week. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. Yeah, there was a small fight between North and South Korea and their spokesman, as North Korea said that the regime, one more time they repeated themselves, saying that the regime will not back down on nuclear weapons. And this time they used the joint US-South Korea military drills as the excuse, and saying that this is threatening North Korea. And for that reason, North Korea has to continue taking care of themselves and protecting themselves by having this nuclear program. On the other hand, South Korean spokespersons were attacking North Korea back, saying that these nuclear weapons and the nuclear programs have been under development for many years before these joint military exercises. Therefore, they called it an irresponsible excuse.
Right. Anthony, Pyongyang's provocations was also addressed by top diplomats at the Quad security framework over in India last week. First then, what exactly did they say, and how does such international pressure perhaps on North Korea look to affect tensions here on the peninsula?
Well, the statement from the Quad meeting in India condemned the recent ballistic missile launches by North Korea, They confirmed the grouping's commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, halting the proliferation of nuclear and missile technologies. They also called for the resolution of the abductions issue, by which they appeared to mean the abduction of Japanese citizens by North Korea. That seems to reflect input by Japan. However, it's not clear what effect this is going to have on North Korea. And the reason is that the U.S.'s Asia policy, the U.S. has sort of been leading on the Quad, and their Asia policy prioritizes dealing with China as a security concern ahead of North Korea. And the opposite is true for South Korea. North Korea is South Korea's primary concern. And that is apparently one reason that South Korea has not yet joined the Quad, and the Quad is not that highly focused on the North Korea issue. There doesn't seem to be any imminent movement to get South Korea into the Quad or a Quad plus grouping. That's not to say that South Korea couldn't contribute a lot to the Quad, but it would probably be more in areas such as humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, infrastructure investment around the region, climate change, and non-traditional security. There's been a lot of interesting speculation as to why South Korea has not been invited by the other members into the Quad. It's not exactly clear. Some people say it's because the U.S. knows that South Korea is not ready to join and possibly take part in what China sees as a bloc intended to confront it, and therefore the U.S. just hasn't asked.
Right, I see. Beyond security, Malene, an AP report drew attention to North Korea's chronic food shortage and, of course, Kim Jong-un's efforts to address it. But there are pundits here in South Korea who reportedly are very skeptical about Kim's efforts to address the food shortage in North Korea. Could you explain this for us?
Yes. So, according to North Korean state media, Kim Jong-un has vowed to stop this food shortage by turning more tideland into farmland, by increasing the grain production, by getting more of these farming machines to North Korea. And all of this sounds very well. But the problem is that what Kim Jong-un really wants is to strengthen the regime's grip over the grain production in North Korea. And experts have pointed that this is probably not a good idea, since whenever we see that the North Korean regime is strengthening the control over grain and the control over where the grain comes from, that will lead to there being less grain in North Korea. This has something to do with North Korea getting a lot of grain transported from China, not really legally. And that means that in the end, North Korea will end up having less food. And right now, North Korea is already around 1 million tons of grain short of what they need per year. So there is quite a big hunger in North Korea right now. It has to do with the corona pandemic, meaning that North Korea shut out almost all of their trade with China. And also has to do with that North Korea has been on this, had a famine crisis in the 1990s, and it is still affecting the country today because there is a shortage of food. And the report also showed that on the times when the North Korean regime has been loosening their control over the grain production and has allowed more trade and more free market coming into North Korea, actually there has been more food and there has been more grain. So this strengthening is worrying several experts.
Right, experts here in South Korea, of course. Anthony, moving forward, in an exclusive interview with CNN, South Korean Prime Minister Han Duck-soo claimed that South Korea does not need nuclear weapons to face North Korea. What do you believe are the broader implications of Han's remarks?
Well, I think it has to be seen in the context of President Yoon Suk-yeol's statement in January to the effect that South Korea might have to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, that statement was walked back fairly quickly by both the South Korean government and the U.S. government, who affirmed that they share the goal of the denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula, both north and south sides, and the presidential office stated that it has full confidence in the U.S. nuclear umbrella and its capability to protect its allies. Now, U.S. allies have, of course, been jittery for decades, for a long time, about the U.S.'s commitment to defend them. And as we know, some allies, as you know, in the early days of the Cold War, have chosen not to trust that assurance and gone nuclear themselves, such as France. Others, like Japan and South Korea, have chosen to not to go that route. The U.S. understands very well that its allies are jittery, and now giving these strategic reassurances has become really a full-time job for the U.S. government. But it's very difficult to reassure any country that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons to defend anything other than itself. The way it makes these decisions, how and when to use nuclear weapons, is very secretive, and the authority to do it really rests almost entirely with the U.S. president. So it's not easy to reassure. The U.S. has always required that its allies give up a portion of their military capabilities, particularly nuclear, in exchange for this protection. That's now changing as the perception of threats mount here in Asia. There's an arms race going on. But were Japan or South Korea to go nuclear, that would cause problems for the alliances, and I think Prime Minister Han's comments probably reflect that.
Right, and staying with Prime Minister Han's interview with CNN Malene, he also touched upon China's potential role here in this region. Do you care to elaborate on that? And also, do include your thoughts regarding Han's remarks about China's potential role.
Yes, the Prime Minister said that China is not the superpower that it used to be. Many countries would like to see China more compliant with global rules, is what the Prime Minister said. I think he's specifically criticizing China for not taking more action to reduce the tension there is on the Korean Peninsula right now, because it is well known that North Korea's biggest trade partner is China, and I think the South Korean Prime Minister really wishes for China to step more in and to play by the more global rules that we have had with sanctions against North Korea. But my thoughts on this matter is that China is not really that interested in playing by the global rules, because the global established rules right now have been established mainly by the United States, by Europe, and China sees this as Western values and as complying to the rules set by the West. And especially now with the conflict in Ukraine, China, along with a lot of other countries, are trying to change these global rules, and they do not wish to follow them in the same way as we see Western nations or Korea or Japan.
Right, hence the standoff. Beyond affairs here on the peninsula, Anthony, President Yoon Suk-yeol's speech to mark Korea's March 1st Independence Movement Day triggered quite a bit of talk here as well as elsewhere, of course. Let's start with the response from neighboring Japan and the U.S. regarding President Yoon Suk-yeol's description of Japan as having transformed from a past aggressor to a present partner.
Yes, well, it's obviously significant that he made these claims on a day that celebrates resistance to Japanese colonial rule, and just months after Japan's decision to acquire offensive military capabilities for the first time since World War II. In Japan, media outlets in their editorials seem to be responding positively and pushing Tokyo to reciprocate while they have the chance, while the current administration is in power, before the next general elections in South Korea. You know, President Yoon came to office making overtures to Tokyo, and Tokyo has responded fairly coolly, but they've warned, because first of all, I think, you know, Pyongyang and Beijing's actions have have compelled them to do so, but also because of administration changes. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida comes from a faction within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party that has traditionally been fairly sympathetic to both South Korea and to Japan, but Kishida was constrained by hawkish right-wing members of the party who were loyal to ex-Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. With Abe's death, that faction is sort of on the back foot, and Kishida may have more of a free hand to pursue his priority policies. And of course, the U.S. has welcomed this trend. They've been pushing South Korea and Japan to mend fences and shelve their historical disputes for quite a long time. What will be interesting to find out is whether or not, how much they pushed for the current deal over the issue of forced wartime labor.
Right, of course. Malene, staying with the same issue, but with a sharply different response from neighboring China, that is. Now, China's Global Times also covered President Yoon Suk-yeol's speech to mark the March 1st Independence Movement Day. Could you tell us a bit more about that particular coverage?
Yes. As we know, Global Times is a state media in China, so it's very much what Global Times covers is very much in line with what the regime in Beijing wants to get out to the world. So Global Times said that Yoon Suk-yeol is a pawn of the U.S. and he was accused of sleepwalking. I think this response has very much to do with what I said previously about China trying to overthrow this kind of global rules and global agenda that basically the entire world has played by until very recently. So this has to do with China would probably like Yoon Suk-yeol to stand more up against Japan, stand more up against the United States, and therefore kind of participating in overthrowing this global order. And I think that is why the Global Times has had this harshly critique of President Yoon Suk-yeol and calling him, accusing him of sleepwalking, calling him a pawn of the United States.
Right, and staying with China, Anthony, the country's National People's Congress kicked off its annual session this past Sunday. I believe we're looking ahead to some massive changes within the government there and the party structure itself. What does this change for China's What does this change, that is, within the party and the government mean for China's ties with its neighboring countries like South Korea?
Well, the National People's Congress is going to ratify changes which were made at the last Communist Party Congress in October. And those mainly include personnel changes, which includes giving leader Xi Jinping a third five-year term, and also giving the top jobs in the government to his loyalists and protégés. You remember that China's rulers have ruled for life, except for a small window between the 1980s and 2018, when Xi Jinping changed the constitution, essentially allowing him to rule for as long as he likes. One of Xi's consistent policies has been to try to turn the Communist Party into a more disciplined and efficient organization, and one that dominates all facets of economics, politics, and society. And so that's going to just become stronger, and that could make China a less appealing destination, I think, for foreign investment. But the trend has been building for quite a long time, and foreign companies have been in the process of shifting manufacturing and operations elsewhere. Does this mean, does this tightening of the party's control over the government mean that the government is going to take a harder line on its neighbors? I don't think that's necessarily clear. I think, you know, under Xi Jinping's term, both Seoul and Tokyo have drawn closer to Washington and gone along with its efforts to sort of build a coalition to confront China. But I think that while Beijing has griped quite a bit about this, I think they've also been careful not to drive Seoul and Tokyo further into Washington's embrace. And so they could have done more. For example, the economic sanctions that happened in 2017 in the wake of the THAAD missile defense debacle. that hasn't been repeated. If anything, those sanctions have been lightened. So we'll see what happens, but I think they're allowing Japan and South Korea to walk a line between the superpowers.
Right. Anthony, based on your coverage of events here in this part of the world in recent times, how does the current standoff, if I may, between the West and China, Russia, as well as North Korea, look to perhaps play out in the months ahead?
Well, there have been some fairly, frightening conversations about the prospect of a sort of axis of authoritarian countries, North Korea, Russia, and China. There's the feeling that what happened in Ukraine could be repeated in Asia because either it emboldens autocratic rulers here to do the same sort of thing, or just because the U.S. will have its hands tied in different parts of the world and be unable to respond. But I think there's been a limit to the connections among both the the authoritarian powers and the Western powers. South Korea and Japan have stuck to this insistence that they cannot sell arms to Ukraine because their laws and policies prohibit it. It's been pointed out to them by the head of NATO and others that Japan, Sweden, and Norway had similar rules, but they changed them. Well, South Korea and Japan are not willing to go there yet because of the effect it could have in the region. China has joined with Russia in conducting incursions into U.S. allies' air defense zones here. But it's also warned against what they call bloc confrontation. It doesn't, because it sees these blocs as confronting them. It doesn't want that. We've seen some cooperation between Asia and Europe in, for example, South Korea backfilling NATO and backfilling Poland and to some extent U.S. supplies of artillery. But I think for all the talk of this, NATO's charter makes it pretty clear that they don't have a mandate to get involved here in Asia. And I think that the U.S. Framing of the issue in terms of democracies versus autocracies doesn't go over so well in Asia. I don't think everyone's buying into it.
Right. And against that backdrop, Anthony, what do you think are the prospects of, do you suppose that efforts by the Yoon administration to perhaps bridge differences with neighboring Japan will ultimately serve to enhance security framework between the allies here in this part of the world?
Well, it seems like the pendulum has swung back today with the deal proposed by South Korea. It appears to be along the lines that we expected. A public foundation will be set up, funded by voluntary donations to pay the survivors, the victims of forced labor during World War II. And the South Korean the Yoon administration hopes to sort of reiterate the 1998 agreement between Kim Dae-jung and Keizo Obuchi, in which Japan states its remorse and apologizes for what happened in World War II, and then they'll try to look forward. And of course, President Biden has already welcomed this as a new chapter. However, one big problem is that the victims themselves have opposed the solution. They want an apology directly from Japan, and they think that Japan, not South Korea, should be compensating them. We've seen agreements run into problems before when there are switches of administrations. The 1998 deal ran into trouble when Japanese leaders visited the Yasukuni Shrine. The 2015 agreement under the Park Geun-hye administration ran into trouble. So Park Jin said this may be the last opportunity, and it may have to do something with, which administration is in power and how many remaining victims there are.
Right. Well, hopefully things will work out for the best. And Anthony, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Malene, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Tuesday.